Imagine this. You wake up from a dream full of faces someone's laugh echoing down a hallway, a familiar glare in a crowded room, a hand offered and then withdrawn. You blink, make coffee, scroll through messages, and the same pattern nudges you. Another flirtation that dissolves, another boss who criticizes in the exact tone, another friend who betrays you in the same season. You change your hairstyle, move apartments, take a new course, and yet the cast of characters in your life seems to be rearranged furniture, different rooms, same shadows. There is a paradox here that makes your bones tighten. You are changing, consciously wanting different outcomes, yet the mirror of other people returns the same reflection. Conventional wisdom tells you to be brave, to set boundaries, to date differently, to network smarter. So why does bravery summon the same old cowardice in others? Why does boundary setting generate the same old defiance? The world should respond to new behavior with new people. Instead, it offers variations on a theme that already haunts you. How can the very freedom you seek reproduce the pattern you're trying to escape? Feel that tension, that existential pinch, where choice collides with recurrence. It pries at the belief that life is a random assembly of encounters and exposes a more frightening possibility, that something within you conspires to recreate familiar characters. Does the cosmos conspire against your happiness? Or is there an internal architect quietly drafting each meeting? What if every accidental encounter is less accident and more invitation? What if those who wound you are not merely threats to avoid, but mirrors demanding to be acknowledged? Carl Jung would not call this coincidence. He would point to projection, the shadow, and the architecture of your complexes. Have you ever felt inexplicably furious at someone over a small slight, only to discover later that the intensity came from a different time, a younger self? Where do those charged responses live when you aren't a provoked buried in a persona you cultivated to be acceptable? Who are you pretending to be when you walk into a room in which disowned parts of yourself are magnetizing specific others to reflect them back? Picture the psyche like a stage. Certain roles are cast repeatedly, not because the world is stingy with parts, but because your psyche scripts the same scenes. The anima or animus, Jung's notion of the inner opposite gender image, can act like an invisible casting director, summoning projection of longing or resentment. The shadow, thick with qualities you rejected in childhood, will show up in the gestures of those you can't stand. Even synchronicity, those uncanny, meaningful coincidences, can feel like fate. Swing when a person appears who seems designed to press the exact sore spot you hoped would heal. Ask yourself, which faces stir an old ache in you? Which encounters leave you whispering the same complaint you heard from your mother or felt in your first heartbreak? Are you certain these people are like that? Or are you certain that you recognize something in them you've been refusing to own? Could recurring relationships be less about matching personalities and more about completing a psychological unfinished sentence? There's a moral sting to this line of thought. If the pattern is partly of your making, then liberation is not solely about finding different people, but about meeting yourself differently. That idea is both terrifying and empowering. Terrifying because it insists you carry responsibility for the choreography of your life. Empowering because it suggests change is possible from within. But before you rush to self-blame or romanticize responsibility, consider the deeper mechanics Jung described: how complexes pull, how projections blind, how individuation demands a painfully honest encounter with the parts of you you've exiled. Now imagine that every reunion with the same kind of people is less a curse and more a pedagogy, an odd, relentless tutor dragging you, often painfully, toward recognition. What are they trying to teach? Which recurring figure is an invitation to reclaim a disowned strength, and which is a mirror to the tender wounds still raw from childhood? How would your life change if, instead of swearing them off, you learned to read the lesson? The cliff you face is this: you can continue rearranging furniture in hopes the shadows will change, or you can turn inward and confront the unseen playwright. But how do you begin to identify those internal scripts? And what practical steps lead beyond recognition to transformation? In the next section, you'll encounter Jung's map for this interior work, the concepts and practices that show why the same people keep appearing and, more importantly, how to change the casting. You begin to see the contour of the problem when you stop blaming the cast and look at the playwright. The recurring people in your life are symptoms, not the disease. Jung called those symptoms complexes charged knots of feeling, memory, and image that thrum beneath your consciousness and surge into the world like magnets. When a complex stirs, it creates a field. People who resonate with that field are drawn to you, not because they are predetermined villains or lovers, but because something in you is humming a frequency they answer. Why does this happen? Think of the psyche as a layered landscape. On the surface sits your persona, the social mask you wear to be seen as competent, lovable, righteous. Below it lies the shadow, a cavern of disowned traits: anger, neediness, greed, desire. Between them, like fault lines, are complexes formed in early relational weather: abandonment, shame, enmeshment. When one of these complexes is activated, you experience the world through it. Neutral gestures are interpreted as rejection. A casual tone becomes cruel. A friendly offer becomes manipulation. The result is projection. You attribute to others what you have not integrated in yourself. Projection is not an occasional mistake. It is an organizing principle of your relational life. Philosophers have named similar engines of repetition in different languages. Nietzsche's notion of eternal recurrence asks whether you would accept living the same life over and over, an existential mirror to your repeating relationships. Do you unconsciously accept the recurrence of certain types of people because a portion of you clings to the comfort of the known, however painful? Schopenhauer's vision of the will, an insatiable striving beneath appearances, suggests another layer. You are propelled by forces you did not choose, driven to recreate familiar suffering because the will, blinkered and hungry, demands reenactment rather than resolution. Society tightens the pattern. Aldous Huxley warned about subtle conditioning. Cultural scripts teach you how to feel, whom to trust, which wounds to hide. Social media amplifies that pedagogy with an algorithmic echo chamber. Your expressions attract similar expressions, and similarity looks like destiny. Capitalism monetizes certain personas, rewarding polished certainty and suppressing messy vulnerability. You learn to present an edited self, which narrows the field of who feels safe to approach you. So the psychic pull of projection meets the cultural push of conformity. Together, they reproduce the same archetypal players. Jean-Paul Sartre would add a moral dimension: bad faith. You may pretend that these repetitions are outside your control to avoid the terror of freedom. It is easier to declare they are all manipulative than to acknowledge, I expect them to be. Saying the first sustains a narrative of victimhood. Admitting the second makes you responsible. Viktor Frankl, who survived the extremes of human cruelty, would ask you what meaning you can take from the recurrence. Suffering need not be meaningless repetition. It can be a question posed to you, insistent, pedagogical, and urgent. Observe how this hidden force shapes your behavior. You adapt to avoid pain. You close down, you perform, you charm, you rage. Each adaptation confirms the pattern because others respond to your adaptation in predictable ways. Closed-offness provokes pursuit or withdrawal. Overgiving provokes dependency. Rigid control provokes defiance. Emotions become weather patterns, forecastable, cyclical, and draining. Identity fragments into fragments that play off one another. The person you are with your family, the person at work, the person you become when love is threatened. Fragmentation feeds projection. Projection fuels repetition. And the consequences are more than private misery. Patterns calcify into destiny if left unexamined. Relationships become training grounds where your wounds are either healed or reinforced. Children watch and internalize the choreography, reproducing it at scale. Trauma becomes generational architecture. In professional life, you hire or are hired into dynamics that mirror earlier inequalities, perpetuating systems of power and submission. Emotionally, you grow adept at reading the wrong cues. Morally, you risk living inauthentically, mistaking recurring actors for immutable fate. There is also a paradox that tightens the throat. Attempting to avoid the pattern often deepens it. You say never again, and then steer toward people who confirm the vow. Why? Because avoidance leaves the complex active but unsatisfied. It enacts the same script in new settings. Jung would say the shadow seeks recognition. If you refuse to meet it, it enlists intermediaries, partners, friends, bosses, to force a confrontation. The psyche prefers engagement to suppression. Suppression is expensive, paid in furtive patterns and sudden explosions. You feel anger at others, but beneath it lies a more delicate sensation grief for parts of yourself you have excised. That grief is the hinge. If you can allow its ache without immediately blaming the mirror, the pattern starts to lose its inevitability. If you cannot, a narrative hardens. People always betray me. The same type of colleagues always undermine me. Every partner becomes exactly the person I feared. Such statements are not metaphysical truths. They are diagnostic clues, pointing directly at complexes and projections. And yet, there is a cruel tenderness to this arrangement. Those recurring figures are both tormentors and midwives. They bring wounds to the surface, insisting that they be seen. Jung frames this as the task of individuation, the slow, often violent process by which you reclaim split-off parts and become more whole. But individuation is not a solitary act of will. It is a negotiation with the archetypal forces that shaped you and the cultural scripts that keep you safe in the predictable. It demands paradox. You must observe without immediately acting, accept without resigning, and choose without seeking control. So what do you do with this knowledge? Do you become a spectator to your life, cataloging patterns like a taxonomist of pain? Or do you risk the terrifying labor of reauthoring the internal script? The deeper consequence waits like a slow avalanche. If you persist in mistaking reflection for reality, you will continue to hire the same actors, and your life will calcify into a museum of rehearsed suffering. If you instead train attention inward toward the complexes, the persona, the shadow, you unlock the possibility that those recurring people were never punishments, but invitations. The cliff edge you now face is not merely psychological. It is ethical and ontological. Do you want to be the same book read by the same eyes for decades? Or do you want to be a book that changes its text? Jung offers a map, but maps require courage to follow. The next movement will hand you tools, ways to recognize your complexes, test your projections, and begin the slow, terrifying unmasking that alters who you attract. Are you ready to stop blaming the actors and start confronting the playwright? You feel it now, the slow, quiet shaping of your life by forces you barely notice until they have already carved grooves into your days. This is not melodrama. It is the anatomy of repetition. Each time you meet the same kind of person, your brain and culture conspire with your shadow to make that meeting seem inevitable. Cognitive biases grease the hinges of recurrence. Confirmation bias whispers that your interpretation of someone's cruelty was always true. The availability heuristic makes the most recent betrayal loom like evidence of a pattern. The fundamental attribution error nudges you to see others as fixed characters while forgiving your own role in the script. These are not abstract ideas. They are neural shortcuts, economies of attention that economize away responsibility. Consider what happens in your nervous system when a familiar wound is pressed. The amygdala flares, signaling alarm, and the limbic system floods you with affect before the prefrontal cortex can speak reason. You do not immediately choose. You react. Those reactions are then encoded into memory as templates. Facial expressions become cues, tones become triggers. Mirror neurons amplify the effect. When you project your old hurt onto another, they unconsciously mirror your stance, confirming your expectation and thereby reinforcing the neural pathway that birthed the expectation. Neuroplasticity means this repetition is not destiny, but habit. The brain will strengthen whatever it rehearses. Do you see the urgency? Every encounter rehearses the same synaptic choreography. Jung named psychological forces complexes that pull like tides beneath your conscious shore. Neuroscience gives those tides a map. Stress hormones consolidate traumatic patterns. Reward circuits reinforce relational habits, even when they are painful. That cocktail fear, reward, and pattern creates a perversely attractive loop. You may feel shame for returning to familiar dysfunction, but the shame itself becomes another magnet, carving a trench that draws in people who reflect that shame. It is not mere coincidence that your worst relationships are also the most instructive. Your nervous system is trying to resolve an old charge by replaying it under slightly different lighting. Cultural conditioning amplifies and codifies these loops. From childhood, you learn scripts: how to be lovable, how not to be seen, what emotions are safe. Institutions, family, school, church, workplace teach you rehearsed responses. Social media then acts as a public rehearsal hall. Algorithms feed you what resonates with your expressed feelings, not necessarily what heals them. If your posts tilt toward bitterness, platforms will return a stream of voices that validate bitterness. You will interpret this as proof that the world is populated by a certain type of person. Capitalist incentives reward polished personas and punish messy truth, so you learn to perform a narrower self. That performance restricts who can enter your orbit, people who respond to your mask rather than your ache. Cultural scripts thus do their silent work. They sculpt the persona and seal the shadow in the wings. The social cost ripples outward. Repeated patterns calcify into cultural norms. Families that model enmeshment produce children who carry that choreography into schools and workplaces. Workplaces that reward domination create leaders who replicate abuse. Communities that mythologize stoicism teach vulnerability to hide. Over years and generations, what begins as a private complex becomes a public architecture. Trauma fossilizes into policy, and the loops you thought were personal reveal themselves as small gears in a larger machine. Do you still think the problem is merely interpersonal? Or do you begin to sense the systemic echo? There's moral and political urgency here. If you never attend to the inner scripts that summon certain people, you will unknowingly reproduce them in micro and macro spheres. Hiring choices, parenting styles, friendships, romantic attachments, all become vectors for transmission. You might escape a relationship only to remake its contours in the next. You might leave a toxic workplace only to recreate the same dynamic in your own team. Each repetition makes it easier for future repetitions to occur. The unseen trap is not only that people recur, but that those recurrences legitimize institutions that breed them. It is a slow civic erosion, private pain turned into public pattern. And yet, the situation contains a paradox that makes it strangest of all. Your attempts to outsmart the pattern often furnish it with new actors. When you try to avoid certain types of people, you sharpen the persona that avoids them. That sharpened persona attracts matchable partners. Avoidance preserves the complex by leaving it unengaged. The shadow refusing to be invisible finds surrogates who can force the encounter the shadow demands. Jung would say the unconscious is obstinate in its pedagogy. It will not be bypassed by cleverness or willpower. The psyche prefers integration to evasion, and when denied, it will employ every intermediary available. This is where urgency moves from intellectual curiosity to personal imperative. Each unexamined projection is a vote for repetition. Each narrated verdict. They always do this. I always attract that. is a sentence you keep signing in invisible ink. If you want different people, you can not only change tactics, you must change the attractor within you. The stakes are intimate and vast. Your emotional bandwidth, the health of your children, the ethics of your workplace, the forms of trust available in your community. You may shrug and say, "I'm only one person," but one rewired nervous system and one reconciled shadow ripple outward. Conversely, one refusal to look keeps generations rehearsing the same scenes. Feel the pressure now. Not an abstract pressure, but a visceral tightening under the ribs. That is the call to individuation pressing through. Jung framed individuation as the labor of becoming more yourself by reclaiming what you have split off. It is not a gentle task. It is the dismantling of the invisible playwright who writes your cast lists. The consequence of ignoring it is slow petrification, your life vitrifying into a diorama of old dramas. The consequence of answering it is disorienting remaking. Which do you prefer? The slow certainty of the old wound or the chaotic promise of change? You stand at an ethical hinge. Continue to offer the world a persona that invites the same players, or begin the dangerous work of tending the inner fires that shape your cast. Recognition has already started. You have named complexes, seen neural loops, felt cultural echoes. The breakthrough waits, but it is not yet given. You must be willing to trace the magnet's pull back to its source, to confront the buried ache that writes your scripts. That confrontation will reconfigure more than who you love or tolerate. It will change the architecture of your days, and in time, the patterns you pass on. The next movement will show you the map Jung left for such labor, the practices that pry open the trap without promising comfort. Will you follow? Will you follow, or will you rebel? Imagine a rebellion that begins not on the street, but behind your ribs. What if the most subversive act available to you is to stop fleeing the people who always return and to learn, deliberately and fiercely, how to read them as curriculum? This is the radical pivot. You do not fix the casting by hunting for different actors. You break the repetitive spell by changing the magnetic field that summons them. It sounds paradoxical because it is. To change what appears, you must change the invisible force that calls it forth. Here is the counterintuitive core. The way out is not avoidance, but curious engagement. When a familiar wound is pressed, your first instinct is to defend, flee, or punish. Jung invites a different response, to arrest the automatic reaction and interrogate it. Instead of answering the old script, you ask, what is this person showing me that I refuse to own? That single question reframes the dynamic from drama to experiment. It shifts you from victim of a repeating play to scientist of your interior. Are you willing to be that scientist? Start small. You are not trying to rewrite your life in a week. You are trying on one new posture at a time. Name the charge. When someone triggers you, stop and label the feeling abandoned, humiliated, invisible. Naming dissolves some of the heat and gives you a vantage point. Jung taught that bringing the unconscious into language robs it of its tyranny. Short-circuit the reflex. Train a 3-breath pause between stimulus and response. That space is the birthplace of choice. In it, you can opt for curiosity over retaliation, ask one clarifying question, or simply breathe into the grief beneath the fury. Make friends with the shadow. Radical, yes. Invite the disowned part of you to speak. Use active imagination. Write a dialogue with the part that needs attention. Ask it what it wants and why it binds you to certain people. This is not therapy light. It is insurgent intimacy with your interior. Conduct relational experiments. Rather than blacklist the type you always meet, engage with one such person differently. Refuse the familiar role they expect of you. If you always placate, try owning a quiet boundary. If you always attack, try naming your fear. Observe what happens. The world will be astonished. So will you. Historical rebels understood this. Jung himself walked into his unconscious like a soldier into a strange country. Red Book is testament to the terrifying bravery of dialoguing with inner figures rather than fleeing them. Gandhi's nonviolent rebellion reframed the dynamics between oppressor and oppressed. By refusing to enact hatred, he changed the field of possible responses. Nelson Mandela, after decades of incarceration, chose to reframe enemies as potential compatriots in a new regime, and thereby transformed a nation's relational economy. These are not sweet stories about forgiveness. They are strategies of influence. Change the rules of engagement, and you change the actors who appear within them. Do not mistake this for moralizing. The rebel you must become is cunning, not saintly. You will practice paradoxical intention, deliberately approach the edge you dread in controlled ways to deflate its power. If you fear abandonment, practice short, scheduled separations that prove you survive them. If you fear being controlled, negotiate small decisions where you stand your ground and keep your connection intact. Each micro-victory rewires pattern into possibility. There are practical weapons you can carry into this rebellion. Keep a journal not of judgments, but of patterns. Who triggers what in you, when, and with what mythology attached. Create a map of your complexes, name them after places or images that stick. The hollow child, the enraged protector, the accommodating host. And you meet someone who resembles a role on that map. Read the map aloud before you react. This ritual makes unconscious chords visible. Invite witnesses. Jung did not pretend individuation was solitary. He sought dialogues and mirrors. Trusted friends, a therapist steeped in depth work, or a support group can serve as reality checks and rehearsal stages. In their presence, you can practice new scripts and receive feedback before you deploy them into vulnerable relationships. Change your rituals to change your attractor. The psyche answers to rhythm. If your day is a loop of reactive scrolling, frenetic work, and numbing consumption, your inner landscape stays raw and magnetized. Introduce tiny rituals that anchor you to a different pole. Morning solitude for 10 minutes of writing. A weekly walk where you allow images to surface. A ritual of apology to yourself when you slip. These small commitments recalibrate what your unconscious expects. And remember a political truth. Changing who you attract is an ethical act that ripples outward. When your relationships no longer dramatize old wounds, you do not merely spare yourself pain. You cease to be a compact vector of harm that would otherwise be passed on. You interrupt generational choreography. That is the highest form of rebellion private work that yields public liberation. You will fail sometimes. The old players will storm back, their scripts rehearsed. Meet that with the stern compassion of a commander who knows the terrain. Journal the rerun, adjust the experiment, and try again. Each time you respond differently, you carve a furrow in your nervous system that will, with enough patience, become new habit. Neuroplasticity is on your side if you stop assuming it is not. There is also a dangerous temptation to weaponize insight, using self-knowledge to manipulate others or to moralize your superiority. Jung warned against inflation. The ego that thinks it has mastered the unconscious is often the ego most deceived by it. Your rebellion must be humble, not grandiose. Its power comes from fidelity to truth, not from the appearance of invulnerability. Finally, reclaim ritualized creativity. Artists have always known what psychologists sometimes forget. To change your world, you must change the images that live in you. Make art, even if your medium is a grocery list rewritten as a lament. Dream deliberately. Before sleep, ask your dream for one scene that will show a way out. In the morning, record it and dialogue with its figures. Gradually, the unconscious will stop delivering the same cast and begin to supply new tutors. You are not destined to keep meeting the same kind of people. You are not merely a magnet of misfortune. You are a field that can be resown. The rebellion is not noisy. It is a series of small renamings, pauses, dialogues, and rituals that alter the attractor within you. It is slow and it is fierce. It will feel like treason to the version of you that preferred the certainty of known pain. That treason is precisely what individuation demands. You are discovering a revolutionary act. To change your life, first change the part of you that keeps calling it back. Imagine for a moment, the moment when the theater goes dark, and you are the only light left in the auditorium. The faces you have been chasing, betrayers, rescuers, critics, lovers, sit in the seats as if waiting for your cue. What if the true revelation is not that those faces keep returning, but that they are not separate from the script you have been writing with tremulous hands? The ultimate truth Jung would hand you, blunt and impossible to ignore, is this: reality is not merely a backdrop that hurls people at you. It is a co-authored scene. You and the world are improvising together, and the melody you hum, your unintegrated shadow, your projected anima or animus, the complex that lives like a fossil in your chest, calls certain harmonies back. Do you feel the vertigo of that? To know you are not merely acted upon, but acting shaping the attractions and repulsions, sculpting the very kinds of people who will appear, is empowerment and indictment in one. How much of your life has been spent crying, "Why them?" without once asking, "What do I make of them by the way I show up?" The paradox is delicious. To stop the recurrence, you must become the thing that frightens you most, someone who will look inward with the same ruthless curiosity you have reserved for others. This is the final, most powerful realization. Your relational world is a mirror of your interior economy. When you are fragmented, the world furnishes fragments. When you are performative, you attract performances. When you refuse to grieve a part of yourself, your life will ensure grief returns as tutor and tyrant. Synchronicity ceases to be mysterious when you see it as a meaningful concordance between inner state and outer event coincidences that are not cosmic taunts, but invitations to integration. Jung taught that the unconscious speaks in images and people. Those returning figures are the unconscious made social. Are you willing to translate their language? What would shift if you stopped asking, "What is wrong with them?" and began to ask, "What is being stirred in me when I see them?" You would discover that hatred, attraction, or contempt are often displaced dialogues with the same child who was once desperate to be acknowledged. You would see recurring colleagues not as implacable archetypes, but as living mirrors showing where you still hide. The deepest liberation comes not when the cast finally changes, but when you no longer need a cast to confirm you. That is individuation's endgame, not isolation from others, but an internal reconfiguration so thorough that your relational field no longer magnetizes repetition. This is where ethics and metaphysics collide. If your inner world sculpts your encounters, then personal work is a moral act. To do the labor of integration is not mere self-help. It is political. Reclaiming your shadow interrupts transmission chains. What was once private pain does not calcify into public pattern. To change your attractor is to change the neighborhood of humanity you affect. Do you want to be a generative center or a repeating wound? Yet this realization is not comfortable. It asks you to be radical in the small ways, to hold your rage as information, to meet your neediness as intelligence, to treat your shame like a map rather than a sentence. It asks you to let the persona unmask itself slowly and to welcome the parts you exiled with a wary tenderness. That is the paradox. The courage to be seen exactly as you are is the same courage that will stop the same kinds of people from finding you interesting. When you stop performing the role that once attracted certain responses, those responses find no purchase. The magnet cools. How do you know you are on the right path? You will know because patterns will not vanish overnight. They will relent. The same phone-number in the dark moments will yield to quieter, stranger encounters, people who surprise you, who do not fit an old dossier. You will make mistakes. You will regress. The unconscious is no polite teacher, But gradually the repetitions lose their tyranny. The intensity of your reactivity will thin. Your life will taste less like rehearsal and more like improvisation. And what of destiny? Does this insight make life merely a workshop of endless correction, or does it enlarge meaning? Jung would say it does both. Individuation is relentless because the psyche is inexhaustible. Yet in that relentlessness, it opens an unfathomable richness. When you stop projecting, objects glow with novelty. People become not archetypes, but human beings, messy, contradictory, alive. Your relations become fewer, perhaps, but deeper. Your days accumulate depth rather than pattern. Picture the cinematic end of this inward revolution. You, older and steadier, walking into a room where faces no longer read off your old script. You catch a reflection in someone's brief smile, and instead of reacting, you allow curiosity. A conversation begins that doesn't replay an old wound, but creates a new image. It is small and astonishing. Then another. The soundtrack changes. The theater lights warm. You are not free of pain, but pain no longer steers the casting. You have become both playwright and audience capable of compassion, capable of firm resistance, capable of choosing a different kind of scene. Will you take that first, terrible step turning the spotlight inward and reading aloud the lines you have been too afraid to study? Will you keep rearranging furniture, or will you become the architect who alters the foundation? The choice sits in your chest like a glimmering coin. Spend it on the easy comforts of certainty, and the same faces will continue to rehearse their parts. Spend it on the slow, brutal, luminous work of integration, and the cast will change because the magnet has been rewired. There is no glamour in this last truth. It is not a promise of immediate relief, but a summons to an existential apprenticeship. The ghosts you meet will remain ghosts only so long as you refuse to listen. Lean in. Learn the language. Change the attractor. The world will respond, because the deepest magic is not that the universe conspires against you, but that it conspires with you.